Some people hug their mother and feel nothing. Not hate, not sadness, just nothing. And that can be terrifying. Maybe it's a birthday call you dread making, a holiday you attend out of duty, not desire, a parent's illness that should break your heart, but mostly just adds another thing to your to-do list. And then comes the guilt. The voice that says, "What's wrong with me? They're my family." But here's something important. Attachment isn't automatic. Blood creates a biological relationship. It doesn't guarantee emotional closeness. Attachment is built through repeated experiences of care, safety, and connection. And sometimes that bond simply doesn't develop in the way people expect. Psychologists call the bond we're talking about attachment. And attachment isn't created simply because two people share DNA. It's built through repeated experiences of care and responsiveness. When a caregiver consistently responds when a child is scared, upset, or in need, the child's developing nervous system begins to learn something important. I am safe. I am seen. I can rely on this person. That's how emotional security grows. So the reverse can also happen. When consistent emotional safety isn't there, the bond may not develop in the same way, even when biology says these people are family. For a lot of people who feel emotionally distant from family, the story isn't dramatic. There was no single event or huge rupture. It's smaller than that. You were fed, clothed, taken to school, and physically cared for. But when you cried, maybe you were told to stop. When you were scared, maybe you were told you were being dramatic. When you wanted to talk about your day, nobody seemed to have the time. This is often described as emotional neglect. And it's difficult to recognize because, on paper, it can look like nothing bad happened. The problem is that something important may not have happened enough: emotional responsiveness. For others, the story is completely different. Instead of being cared for, you became the caregiver. You learned to manage a parent's emotions before you even understood your own. Maybe you mediated arguments you didn't cause. Maybe you became the responsible one because someone had to be. This is called parentification, and it can teach a child something very different from emotional safety. Instead of learning, I can relax and be cared for, they learn, I have to be useful. I have to hold everything together. Over time, responsibility can start to feel like love. But when you're finally older, you may realize you never really got to rest inside that relationship. Here's what can happen inside the brain and nervous system. When a child experiences caregivers who are inconsistent, sometimes warm, sometimes unavailable, sometimes unpredictable, the brain begins to learn that reaching out is uncertain. If asking for comfort sometimes works and sometimes doesn't, the child may eventually stop asking. The brain is trying to protect the child from repeated disappointment, so they learn to become independent. They learn to handle emotions alone. They learn not to expect too much from other people. That's not necessarily coldness, it's an adaptation. The problem is that an adaptation learned in childhood can sometimes continue into adulthood, even when the person is finally in a safer environment. This is the part that's difficult for many people to accept. Biology creates a relationship, but it doesn't automatically create emotional attachment. Sharing DNA tells you that someone is your parent, sibling, or child. But your nervous system doesn't simply look at a family tree and decide, I feel safe here. Emotional bonding is influenced by repeated experiences of care, trust, comfort, and connection. Hormones and brain systems involved in bonding can respond to these experiences, but they don't magically create closeness just because two people are related. So when someone says, but they're your family, you have to feel something. They may be confusing biological relationship with emotional experience. So what happens when someone finally recognizes this pattern and starts creating distance? From the outside, it can look cold, but from the inside, it may be self-protection. If closeness has repeatedly come with stress, disappointment, or emotional exhaustion, creating distance can feel safer than continuing to reach. That doesn't automatically mean the person hates their family. It may simply mean they have stopped forcing a connection that never felt natural or safe. Sometimes distance isn't the absence of feeling. Sometimes it's the result of years of trying not to be hurt. There's another layer that makes this even harder: culture. In many families and communities, family closeness is treated almost like a moral obligation. You're expected to call, to visit,
मम्मी
to
पापा
show
की
respect. And there's nothing wrong with doing those things. But respect and emotional closeness aren't exactly the same. Duty and love aren't always the same either. You can fulfill every family obligation and still feel emotionally distant. And when society tells you that you shouldn't feel that way, you may end up spending more energy feeling guilty about your emotions than understanding where they came from. But here's what's important. Feeling distant from your family doesn't automatically mean you're broken, selfish, incapable of love, or destined to feel this way forever. A person can feel distant from their family and still form incredibly deep relationships with friends, partners, or their own children. Early experiences can influence how we connect, but they don't completely decide our future. People can learn new patterns. They can experience safe relationships later in life. They can build trust where it wasn't built before. The absence of attachment in one relationship doesn't mean you're incapable of attachment everywhere. If this sounds familiar, maybe the most useful question isn't, why don't I feel what I'm supposed to feel? Maybe it's, what would emotional safety have needed to look like for me? And then ask yourself, where do I feel safe enough to connect now? You don't have to force an emotion into existence. You can become curious about your own history. You can understand what was missing. And you can begin building relationships where trust and connection are actually earned through consistency. So if you've ever hugged someone you're supposed to love and felt nothing, try not to judge yourself for it. Your emotional responses have a history. Your brain and nervous system learned from the relationships you experienced. The question isn't simply, why don't I feel this? It's, what would it take for me to feel safe enough to connect? Because sometimes, emotional attachment isn't something we're automatically given. Sometimes it's something we slowly learn, and sometimes it's something we build.